In January 2022, he was rescued near Grendel Pass after disappearing in a record-breaking snowstorm. This is his account. They always said the winters here were longer than anywhere else. He'd never believed that until the snow came early and refused to leave. The radio called it a historic front, a collision of Arctic air that would smother the valley for days. But he'd heard forecasts like that before, warnings that never quite materialized. So when the neighbor's dog vanished into the storm, he didn't think twice about going after it. That morning the sky was already white. Snow fell in fat, drifting flakes that swallowed the trees and blurred the edge of the road. He pulled on the heavy canvas parka he hadn't worn in years, checked the stove banked low in the cabin, and stepped outside. The cold was immediate, a clean, biting cold that found every seam in his clothing. The dog's tracks wound away from the porch, vanishing into the pines. He followed them. The first half hour was simple. The trail was fresh enough that he could pick it out even as the drifts began to rise. He called the dog's name, voice muffled in the dense air. No answer came back. He knew these woods well. Each bend of the trail, every old stump and half-buried fence post. But the deeper he went, the more the landmarks blurred under white. By midday, the sky had darkened to the color of steel. Snow fell faster, rising past his boots. The trail thinned. Once he crouched to brush aside a drift and found nothing beneath. No paw prints, no sign the animal had ever passed that way. His breath fogged the air in quick, shallow bursts. He turned in a slow circle, trying to fix his position. Nothing looked familiar. He forced himself to keep moving. Staying still was worse. In the cold, stillness was the same as giving up. By late afternoon, the light had failed almost entirely. He flicked on the lantern strapped to his pack, the beam tunneling through the snow. The trees seemed to press closer, their shapes twisted into towering silhouettes that shifted when he wasn't looking. The wind rose in low moans that curled between the trunks. Once he thought he heard the dog's bark, high and thin, almost pleading. He called out, stepping toward the sound. Silence returned. He checked his compass. The needle twitched and wavered as if unsure where to point. He tapped the casing, but the movement didn't settle. The wind shifted again.
In that momentary lull, he caught sight of something through the trees. A single dark shape crouched low to the snow, unmoving. His heart leapt. He raised the lantern, stepping closer. It wasn't the dog. A half-collapsed cabin stood there, its roof sagging under the weight of ice. One shutter hung askew, creaking each time the wind changed. He'd never seen it before. He approached cautiously, breath loud in the hush. Up close, the cabin looked older than anything still standing should. The wood was gray and splintered, the door ajar by a hand's width. For a moment, he considered turning back, trying to retrace his steps before dark swallowed the last sense of direction. But the cold made that choice impossible. Already, numbness crept up his legs. His gloves felt clumsy, more like sacks of cloth than hands. He pushed the door open. Inside, the dark pressed close, stale with old wood and something harder to name. He swept the lantern beam across the walls, bare boards, a rusted stove, a cot piled with a drift of rotted blankets. No footprints, no sign of recent use. He stepped inside, closed the door against the storm, and sank onto the edge of the cot. His breath echoed in the emptiness. For the first time, a thought rose he couldn't push away. He might not make it home. He pulled the blankets around his shoulders and let the lantern burn. In the darkness beyond the walls, the wind continued its slow, patient calling. He woke sometime in the night, unsure what had pulled him from the shallow drift of sleep.
The lantern had burned low, its light a dull orange. Shadows pooled in the corners of the cabin, shifting whenever he moved. For a long moment he listened. The wind still pressed against the walls, rattling the loose shutter. Snow hissed against the roof in soft waves. Nothing else. He let his breath out slowly, each exhale clouding the cold air. His fingers had stiffened while he slept. He worked them inside his gloves, flexing until sensation returned in bright, painful flashes. When he was sure he could stand, he crossed to the stove. The iron door creaked as he pulled it open. Inside, only a layer of ash remained. No wood, no coals. He closed it again, the sound too loud in the hush. The cold had settled into the cabin's bones. Each board seemed to radiate a steady chill that bit through the blankets he'd wrapped around himself. He scanned the floor for any sign of tracks, anything that might explain the unease riding the back of his neck. But the boards were unmarked. No snow, no disturbance. Just as he turned to settle again on the cot, a sound broke the quiet. A single, muffled bark. His breath stopped. He turned to face the door, pulse rising. Another bark, closer, higher pitched, echoing through the trees just beyond the walls. He stepped forward, straining to hear over the wind. Then came the third sound. Not a bark this time, but something like a voice. A low, broken call that wavered before the wind swallowed it. He knew then that if he opened the door, he would see nothing. The same drifts, the same dark trees. Still, his hand reached for the latch. He paused, fingers resting on the cold metal. In the dark beyond the window, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of pale shape weaving between the trunks. His heart hammered in his throat. He swallowed, the sound loud in the hush. Slowly, he drew back. He turned the lantern up, letting the light fill the small space. The walls glowed in the dim orange, each crack and splinter thrown into relief. The thought rose again, unbidden. He might never leave this place. He tried the radio clipped to his belt, thumbing it on. A crackle of static filled the silence. He adjusted the frequency. Static again. No voices. No confirmation he wasn't entirely alone. He set it on the cot and crouched to check his pack. A few protein bars. A half-full canteen already near freezing. The spare batteries wrapped in cloth. He counted each item twice, trying to steady his breathing. Outside, the wind dropped for a single heartbeat. In that lull, he heard footsteps crossing the snow. Not the quick skittering movement of an animal, a measured, deliberate tread, circling the cabin. He waited, hand pressed flat against the pack. The footsteps stopped just beyond the wall, too close. Silence fell again. He stayed crouched, every muscle locked. Minutes crawled by. The cold crept deeper. When he finally dared to rise, he felt hollow, as if part of him had already accepted he might never see morning. He climbed back onto the cot, drawing the blankets tight. The lantern guttered as a draft slid through the cracks in the walls. He closed his eyes, but sleep refused to come. Outside, the wind began again. Somewhere beneath it, something else moved, slow and patient, tracing a circle in the snow. He lost track of the hours after that. At some point, the lantern finally died, leaving only the dim reflection of snow through the warped glass of the window. He lay on the cot, every muscle rigid, listening for the footsteps to return. They never did, but he could feel them,
Or rather, he felt the shape of something just beyond the walls, waiting. When exhaustion finally blurred the edge of his fear, he slipped into a shallow, fevered sleep. He dreamed he was standing outside the cabin, the snow rising past his knees, staring across the clearing. The dog stood on the far side, motionless, watching him with eyes too bright. In the dream, he tried to call its name, but no sound left his throat. The dog tilted its head, then turned and vanished into the trees. He woke with a start. His breath came ragged, his heart thumping against his ribs. The cold was deeper now, a brittle layer over everything. He rubbed his hands together, willing warmth into his fingers. He glanced toward the window. The night had begun to lift, the sky paling to a dull gray. Snow still fell, but in smaller, hesitant flakes. He sat up slowly. Every joint protested, stiff from hours of stillness. He reached for his canteen, took a shallow sip. The water tasted metallic, half frozen. The silence pressed closer, heavier than before. He told himself dawn meant safety, that daylight would strip away whatever had circled the cabin in the dark. But as he looked around the small room, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. Near the door, in a drift that had sifted in through a split in the boards, a line of prints marked the snow. Small, perfectly formed, as if something had stepped inside while he slept, and then left again. His breath stilled. He crouched to study them, though every part of him wanted to look away. 4 prints in all, spaced precisely, leading from the door to the cot. Then nothing. No return trail. He stood so fast he nearly stumbled. The cold seemed to thicken around him, pressing against his skin. He crossed to the door and placed his hand on the latch. A single thought pulsed behind his ribs. I can't stay here. Whatever waited outside might be worse. But he knew if he remained in this place, he would never find the strength to leave again. He drew a slow breath, steeling himself. Then he pulled the door open. The wind struck him in a solid wave. Snow spiraled across the threshold, biting his face and hands. He stepped out, bracing one shoulder against the frame to keep from falling. The clearing lay quiet in the dim dawn.
No trucks, no movement. Only the endless drifts, reshaped by the night. He turned to pull the door closed behind him. That's when he saw it. On the inside of the door, etched into the frost, were 4 parallel lines, as if a hand, or something like a hand, had rested there before slipping back into the storm. He didn't linger to look closer. He turned and trudged away from the cabin, each step an effort as the snow clutched at his boots. Beyond the clearing, the trees closed around him again, muffling the wind. He didn't look back. For hours, he walked without direction, driven by a need to put distance between himself and that place. The forest became a blur of white and gray. His mind drifted in fragments, snatches of thought, memory, and the echo of that bark he'd heard in the dark. Once he thought he glimpsed movement between the trees, a small shape trotting ahead, just out of reach. But when he called out, the shape dissolved into drifting snow. His voice sounded brittle in the empty air. By late morning, the cold had worked its way past his clothing, into the soft parts of him he couldn't protect. Each step felt heavier, slower. When he stumbled over a buried root, he nearly didn't rise again. He lay there, cheek pressed to the snow, watching his breath fade in thin, ragged clouds. For the first time, he wondered if he would simply sleep, if the cold would take him gently,
without struggle. Then a sound reached him. Something new. A low, steady hum. Mechanical. He forced his head up. Through the trees, a pale shape loomed. A communications tower, half buried in snow. Hope flared, small and fierce. He pushed himself upright, staggering toward it. He didn't know if it was real, but he had to try. He stumbled the last 20 meters to the tower, each step slower than the one before. Up close, the structure was little more than a steel skeleton braced against the wind. Sheets of ice clung to the latticework, refracting the pale dawn light. A small utility shed crouched at its base, half buried by drifting snow. He pressed one gloved hand to the door. The metal burned with cold through the fabric. He pushed. The door gave reluctantly, hinges shrieking as they swung wide. Inside, the air was stale but still. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with coils of wire and rusted tools. In one corner, a radio console perched on a sagging table. His heart lurched. He crossed to it, nearly tripping over a length of frozen cable.
He set his satchel down with shaking hands and bent to inspect the unit. The power light was dark. He traced the thick cord to where it disappeared into a breaker box, crusted with frost. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing hard. Each inhale scraped at his throat. He wiped his glove across the breaker panel and pried it open. Inside, the switches were stiff with ice. He braced himself and shoved the main switch up. Nothing. His chest tightened. He hit it again, harder. A single red light blinked to life on the console. He let out a sound, part laugh, part sob. He sank onto the nearest crate, fighting to steady his breath. When he could trust his hands again, he picked up the microphone. His voice cracked, raw from cold and fear. He swallowed. "This is Daniel Avery. I'm stranded north of Grendel Pass, requesting immediate assistance." Static swallowed his words. He tried again. "Repeat. This is Daniel Avery. I'm at the old comms tower. Severe exposure. I need help." For a moment, only silence answered. Then, the speaker crackled. "Copy, Avery. Stay. Location. Team. Inbound." The message fragmented in static, but it was enough. Relief crashed over him so hard he nearly dropped the mic. He set it down carefully, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile connection. The cold pressed closer in the quiet. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and leaned back against the wall. He knew he should ration his energy, conserve warmth, but fatigue pinned him in place. His eyes drifted shut, and in that thin space between waking and sleep, he heard the dog again. A single bark. Close now. Almost inside. His eyes snapped open. The shed lay as he'd left it. No movement, no sound. He rubbed his face, fighting the fog of exhaustion. Then, something scraped across the roof. A slow, deliberate drag of weight over the metal. He held his breath, listening. Another scrape. Closer to the door. He rose, joints screaming. His hand found the radio mic again, fingers locking around it. He pressed the call button, voice low and shaking. "Rescue team, please confirm. There's something." The words died. Through the narrow window, a shape moved between the trees. Too tall to be the dog, pale against the darker trunks. It passed from view without turning. His pulse thundered in his ears. He strained to see any sign it had been real. Nothing moved. He backed away from the window, forcing himself to breathe. The rational part of his mind struggled for explanations. Fatigue, hypothermia, the way shadows stretched at dawn. But another part of him knew those excuses were lies. Something had followed him from the cabin, something that waited for him to believe he was safe. He sank back onto the crate, arms wrapped tight around himself. Time passed in ragged fragments. Once the radio hissed again, another garbled promise of rescue, ETA unknown. He didn't answer. He fixed his gaze on the floor, willing himself not to look at the window again. Outside, the wind rose in a long, hollow sigh. It sounded almost like breathing. The light outside had begun to shift again, sliding from dull gray to a colder, bluer tone that meant evening wasn't far. He didn't know how many hours he'd spent in the shed. The cold had settled into him so thoroughly he couldn't remember what warmth had ever felt like. He forced himself to stand. Each movement seemed to echo in the small space, louder than it should have been. The radio remained silent, no new messages. He crossed to the door, rested one hand against the metal. The wind pressed back, humming through the seams. He told himself rescue was close, that he just had to endure a little longer. Then he heard it again. A bark, sharp, clear, impossibly near. He turned to the window. Nothing. A second bark followed, this one behind the shed, almost against the wall. His throat tightened. He couldn't pretend anymore that he was imagining it. Slowly, he reached for the latch. The metal felt like ice under his glove. He hesitated. Another sound joined the barking, a slow, scraping tread moving in a wide circle around the building. Step, drag, step, drag. He swallowed, his breath shallow. He told himself to wait inside, to hold out for the rescue team, but some instinct older than reason insisted he couldn't stay here. He unlatched the door and eased it open. The cold slapped him full in the face, shocking in its ferocity. The clearing lay still, wind flattening drifts into rippling patterns. He stepped out, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No tracks marked the snow, though he knew they should have been there. He took a cautious step around the shed. At first, he didn't see it. Then his gaze lowered to the snow near the back wall. A line of prints, smaller than a man's, but perfectly spaced, leading in a wide arc that ended 10 feet away. He followed them with his eyes, heart hammering. At their end, the snow was smoothed flat again, as if the trail simply ceased to exist. He crouched, breath fogging the air. The prints were sharp-edged, fresh. His gaze lifted, scanning the woods, and that's when he saw it. Between two trees stood a figure, tall, thin, so pale it seemed almost to glow in the failing light. He froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move. The wind caught his coat, snapping the fabric around his legs. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the clearing, man and shape, both motionless. Then the figure tilted its head, just slightly. Something inside him cracked. He backed away, step by step, unwilling to break eye contact. The figure remained still, watching. When he reached the shed door, he turned and fled inside, slamming the latch home with a hollow clack. His breath came in ragged pulls. The radio crackled once, startling him so badly he almost fell. "Avery, this is rescue. 20 minutes. Stay where you are." His heart thudded so hard he pressed a hand to his chest. 20 minutes. He repeated it under his breath, a litany against the cold and the fear. He sank onto the crate again, hugging his arms tight to his ribs. Outside, the wind rose.
A shape passed by the window, too fast to see clearly. He clenched his eyes shut. When he opened them, the window was empty again. He didn't look at it after that. The last stretch of time bled into a single vibrating awareness of how close the thing had been, how close it still might be. When the low thump of rotor blades reached him, he almost couldn't believe it. He stood, legs weak, and pressed his hand to the door. Outside, a searchlight swept across the clearing, turning the snow to blinding white. He took a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And for the first time since the dog disappeared, he knew he was going to survive. He stepped into the blinding white of the searchlight, blinking against the sudden glare. The helicopter hovered low above the treetops, its blades kicking loose drifts into swirling clouds. A figure in an orange jacket dropped from the open door, landing in a crouch before rising and jogging across the clearing. "Daniel Avery?" the rescuer called over the roar. He nodded, though his voice still refused to work. "Stay where you are," the rescuer shouted, lifting one hand. "We're getting you out." He stayed rooted to the spot, the cold and the relief warring inside him until he felt almost hollow.
The rescuer crossed the last few yards and reached for his arm. The grip was strong, reassuring. "You're going to be okay," the man said, leaning closer so he could hear. "We've got you." He nodded again, throat too tight to answer. Together they moved across the clearing. The snow churned around their legs, the wind tugging at his coat. He risked a glance back at the shed. Nothing moved near the door or the window. But as the searchlight swung past the tree line, he thought he saw a pale shape just beyond its reach, standing perfectly still between the trunks. He looked away before he could be sure. The rescuer pressed a radio to his mouth. "Base, this is Echo 1. We have the survivor. Preparing for lift." A burst of static crackled in reply. They reached the helicopter. Another rescuer leaned down to grab his other arm, guiding him up the narrow steps. The cabin was a blast of heat and noise that made him reel. He collapsed onto the bench, pressing his hands between his knees to stop them shaking. The first rescuer climbed in after him and pulled the door shut. The sound cut away instantly, replaced by the steady thrum of the engines. "Vitals are weak but stable," the rescuer said to someone over the headset. He didn't hear the reply. His gaze fixed on the small window. Through it, he watched the clearing recede as the helicopter lifted. The trees fell away, the shed shrinking to a dark square in the snow. He told himself not to look for anything in the shadows, not to search for the shape he thought he'd seen. But as the tree line blurred beneath them, he couldn't help it. For a heartbeat, he glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, still, watching the helicopter rise. Then it vanished behind the trees. He turned his eyes to the floor, breath hitching. "You're safe now," the rescuer said beside him, voice muffled by the headset. He nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Minutes passed in a haze. The warmth of the cabin worked its way slowly into his skin, chasing back the worst of the numbness. He closed his eyes, but behind them he saw the same pale figure waiting in the trees, waiting as if it knew he would come. He swallowed, forcing the thought away. When the helicopter banked south, he felt the last threads of the clearing slip free. The fear didn't vanish. He suspected it never would. But he was alive, and sometimes that was the only victory a place like this allowed.